The Siege of Eger, one of the most remarkable defensive victories in Europe's struggle against the Ottoman Empire in the 16th century. In 1552, the Ottomans advanced with 40,000 elite soldiers, armed with modern weapons and heavy cannons capable of turning stone walls into dust. Eger had only a few thousand defenders. By every calculation, the fortress should have fallen quickly. There was no clear path to survival, but that collapse never came. Behind those walls stood people who refused to accept the odds. Soldiers fighting past exhaustion, civilians rebuilding walls as fast as they were destroyed, and a young inventor whose strange weapons turned an unstoppable advance into chaos. A united effort, driven by sheer will, transformed the siege into legend. To understand how the Siege of Eger became one of the most unlikely stands in European history, you have to picture the world just before it unfolded. A world stretched thin, tired, and waiting for something terrible to arrive. For decades, Hungary had lived under a shadow. A generation earlier, at Mohács, its army had been shattered so completely that the kingdom never truly recovered. The king died, nobles scattered, and the land itself split apart. One region fell under Ottoman rule. Another looked desperately to the Habsburgs, and everything in between became a patchwork of villages trying simply to survive. And as the years passed, the shadow grew longer. Fortress after fortress collapsed. Buda, once the proud capital, was already lost. Szolnok, Temesvar, Vesprem, names that had once meant safety now marked the slow retreat of a nation. Each year the frontier shrank, and each year the crescent banners climbed farther north. By the early autumn of 1552, the Ottoman Empire saw an opportunity too perfect to ignore. North of the broken frontier lay Hungary's precious mining towns, rich with silver, rich enough to pay armies and sustain kingdoms. If these towns fell, the Habsburgs would bleed coin, soldiers, and influence. And just before those mines stood a single hilltop fortress, guarding the roads like a lonely gatekeeper. Eger, a place so small that many foreign generals barely bothered to pronounce its name. It was not a mighty city or a grand strategic capital. It was a quiet stronghold surrounded by fields, vineyards, and narrow streets where farmers, soldiers, priests, and craftsmen lived shoulder to shoulder. People there understood exactly how fragile their world had become. They had seen refugees dragging carts along the roads. They had heard whispers of burning towns. They had watched distant smoke rising from fortresses that once seemed untouchable. No one in Eger believed they were the center of anything. But they understood this: if their walls ever gave way, everything behind them, the mines, the countryside, and the northern approach to Europe, would lie open and exposed. Far to the south, in the warmer plains closer to the heart of the empire, Ottoman commanders were already setting plans into motion. The empire had tasted victory across 3 continents. Its armies were seasoned, confident, and supported by a machine of war more organized than anything Hungary could field. 2 commanders, Ahmed Pasha and Ali Pasha, prepared to lead a combined force northward. They studied maps, calculated distances, and sent messages to Constantinople confirming what everyone in the imperial court already believed. Eger would fall quickly. Eger should fall quickly. Eger was simply too small to stand in the way of an empire. And so the preparations began. The Ottoman army did not move like an ordinary army. It moved like a traveling world. Tens of thousands of infantry and cavalry gathered on the plains. Engineers assembled crates of tools, beams, and iron spikes for siege works. Siege masters inspected powder, fuses, and the long wooden supports needed to build assault ramps and mining tunnels. Long lines of camels and oxen strained beneath the weight of bronze cannons. Some small enough for rapid fire, others so massive they required entire teams to move. These guns were the pride of the empire. Weapons designed to turn stone into dust and fear into surrender. Wagons loaded with food, water, tents, timber, and medical supplies stretched beyond the horizon. Blacksmiths hammered repairs late into the night. Drums rolled as units formed into marching columns. The entire host moved with an effortless confidence born from years of victories. They had crushed strongholds far larger than Eger. They had broken armies far greater than anything Hungary could now assemble. And when the signal finally came, on a warm morning at the edge of autumn, the ground seemed to tremble beneath the first heavy steps. Under thousands of snapping crescent banners, the great Ottoman host began its march north. Its destination was Eger. Its commanders expected another easy conquest. But beyond the hills, inside that small, quiet fortress, waited a people who had already decided they would not run, no matter what was coming. When the Ottoman army began moving north, its advance changed everything across the frontier. Villages emptied, roads fell silent, and inside Eger, the weight of what was coming settled over the fortress long before the enemy appeared. In the council chamber, the nobles understood the situation with unsettling clarity. Reinforcements were unlikely to arrive in time, and retreat would leave the entire region exposed. Eger needed someone who could manage a siege with discipline, strategy, and a steady hand. That decision led to István Dobó. His reputation was built not on dramatic victories, but on composure. He knew how fortresses survived, through organization, endurance, and the ability to keep people focused when fear threatened to unravel them. He was the only one who could take Eger's limited resources and turn them into something that might hold. When Dobó arrived, he went straight to work. He inspected the walls from corner to corner, evaluating angles of attack, weak points in the stone, blind spots, and the positions where cannons could cause the most damage. He looked at the gates, the wells, the ammunition stores, the food supplies, and the narrow streets that could become choke points if the enemy broke through. He was not looking for strengths. He was counting vulnerabilities and matching each one with a plan. Once Dobó began, the fortress changed quickly. Masons reinforced the outer sections of the walls. Carpenters strengthened the gates and built wooden barriers for fallback positions. Blacksmiths repaired armor, sharpened blades, and produced arrowheads in large batches. Women cleaned and filled water barrels, organized food stores, and prepared simple medical stations. Young people carried stones and sandbags to the ramparts. Soldiers trained from sunrise to nightfall, drilling until their movements felt automatic. The courtyards turned into practice grounds, the armories filled with freshly repaired weapons. Every storage room, every hallway, every tower became part of a larger defensive system. Eger was small, but now it was prepared. As the days passed, scouts reported movements to the south. Slow at first, then closer, then too close to ignore. The signs grew clearer. Abandoned farms, distant smoke, and a haze along the horizon that grew heavier each day. Late one afternoon, the shape of the approaching army finally revealed itself. A broad, shifting cloud rose from the southern plains. Steady, wide, and unmistakably the movement of a massive force. Everyone on the walls understood that the time for preparation was ending. The siege had not yet begun, but its arrival was no longer distant. It was approaching with the certainty of a tide. And Eger, newly fortified and united under Dobó's command, stood ready for the first impact. By the time the Ottoman army reached the outskirts of Eger, the valley below the fortress had already begun to change. The plain that once held open fields and scattered farmhouses was now filling with movement. Organized, disciplined, overwhelming. Columns of infantry poured into position, cavalry units rode in long arcs, and wagons rumbled into neat rows as if an entire city had decided to settle beneath the walls. From the ramparts, the defenders watched the transformation unfold. It wasn't chaos. It wasn't noise for the sake of fear. It was precision, the kind of precision that only an empire could achieve. Within hours, tents stretched across the valley in ordered clusters, each marked by banners fluttering in the steady wind. Smoke rose from cook fires as thousands of soldiers prepared for the days ahead. Then came the artillery. Teams of oxen dragged heavy bronze cannons into place along the slopes facing the southern walls. Engineers followed with wooden beams, ropes, and powder kegs. They worked with practiced efficiency, leveling the ground, fixing angles, and preparing the firing positions that would soon hammer against Eger's defenses. Even at a distance, the defenders recognized the size of some of the cannons, weapons capable of breaking apart stone that had stood for generations. The sight left no room for doubt. The full force of the siege had arrived. Inside the fortress, the mood shifted once again. The weeks of preparation under Dobó had created order, but now that order hardened into resolve. People moved with purpose, not panic. Soldiers checked their weapons, tightened the leather straps on their armor, and positioned themselves along the battlements. The courtyards filled with stacks of stones, barrels of water, and spare shields. Eger had become a fortress in every sense of the word. It was during this final stage of preparation that another figure stepped forward, one whose contribution would soon shape the course of the siege. Gergely Bornemissza, a young man known in the fortress for his cleverness, had been working quietly in the shadows of the inner courtyard. But with the Ottoman artillery now lining the hillsides, he presented his ideas to Dobó. Bornemissza was not a soldier in the traditional sense. He was an inventor, the kind who looked at gunpowder and saw possibilities rather than danger. He had spent days assembling mixtures, testing shapes, preparing containers that could be thrown from the walls with devastating effect. Barrels packed with flammable materials. Glass spheres filled with explosive powders. Crude but deadly devices designed to burst into flame upon impact. His work represented a different kind of defense, one created not from strength, but from ingenuity. And in a fortress where numbers were not on their side, ingenuity mattered. Throughout the afternoon, the defenders watched as the Ottoman camp continued to expand. Supply caravans arrived one after another. Siege engineers marked out lines in the dirt, preparing for trench work and forward batteries. Cavalry detachments patrolled the perimeter, ensuring no escape route remained open. By evening, the valley glowed with thousands of small fires. From the walls, Eger looked down upon an ocean of tents and flickering embers, a reminder of the scale of what they were about to face. Yet the fortress remained steady. The gates were barred, the torches were lit, and the final preparations were completed with quiet determination. As darkness settled, the drums of the Ottoman army rolled across the valley. Slow, deep, deliberate. The sound carried upward over the walls and into the stone courtyards, a signal that the siege was no longer approaching. It had arrived. And inside those walls, among soldiers, craftsmen, families, and the small team of inventors gathered around Bornemisza's creations, Eger prepared to endure the first assault of a force far larger than itself. At dawn, the siege finally began to show its true weight. The first Ottoman cannon fired across the valley, its impact slamming into the southern wall of Eger with a force that shook dust from the rafters and sent fragments of stone skittering across the battlements. Moments later, more guns joined in, a steady, punishing rhythm that hammered the same sections of wall again and again. The defenders responded as best they could. Their smaller cannons fired downward at the Ottoman artillery crews, hoping to disrupt their work. Muskets cracked from the towers. Arrows arced into the valley. But the difference in power was unmistakable. The Ottoman guns had range, volume, and brute force. Eger had accuracy and elevation, but far fewer weapons. Inside the fortress, movement took on a tight, disciplined urgency. Runners carried water to the ramparts. Engineers marked cracks before they grew wider. Workers shoveled debris away to keep firing lines clear. Everyone understood the same truth. The walls could not take this punishment forever. By late morning, the cannon fire intensified, and under its cover, Ottoman infantry began advancing across the field, shields raised, engineers carrying tools and bundles of wood. Their movements were controlled and confident. the same advance that had overwhelmed countless fortresses across Europe. But halfway up the slope, discipline collided with something they did not expect. Bornemissa's team stepped into position along the inner parapets. Their weapons looked small, barrels sealed with resin, clay spheres packed with explosive mixtures. But they held a kind of danger none of the attackers had seen. The first barrel rolled down the hill, bouncing awkwardly, ignored by the front ranks who assumed it was debris from the bombardment. Then it detonated. A burst of flame ripped outward, lighting the slope with sudden fire. Shields dropped instantly. Soldiers stumbled back. Others froze, unsure what had struck them. Before any order could be restored, another barrel exploded, throwing burning oil across the ground. The reaction was immediate. Formations broke, men scattered sideways. Engineers abandoned their tools, and several soldiers slipped on the burning oil, crashing into one another in a chain of confusion. Then the clay spheres fell, small, fast, unpredictable. They shattered against shields and armor, erupting in sparks and sharp flashes of powder. The flames clung to wood and cloth. The explosions came irregularly, making it impossible for the infantry to predict where to step or how to reform. The advance collapsed into a forced retreat down the slope. Not a rout. The Ottoman army was too seasoned for that, but a moment of shock, a rare hesitation from a force that believed it had already won. For the defenders, that moment was everything. Archers and musketeers poured fire into the disrupted ranks. Stones crashed down from the battlements. Even a few of Eger's small cannons landed shots among the scattered infantry, driving them farther back. Yet no one in the fortress mistook this for victory. Cracks continued spreading across the walls. Exhaustion set in, and the enemy artillery never stopped firing. By evening, smoke clung to the southern side of the fortress. The air tasted of powder and grit. Soldiers leaned against the battlements, listening to the distant rumble of cannons being repositioned for the next day. But despite the strain, Eger endured the first full assault. The walls still stood, the defenders still held their posts, and the Ottoman army, for the first time, had been forced to step back. The day ended without collapse, and that alone was a victory. The days that followed turned into a grinding test of endurance. The Ottoman artillery did not ease. Every morning began with the same deep concussion of cannon fire striking the southern wall, each blast adding new cracks to the stone and widening the damage left from the day before. Dust hung constantly in the air. Parts of the battlements had to be cleared again and again just to allow defenders to move. Eger was no longer bracing for impact. It was absorbing it. As the wall weakened, the Ottomans shifted tactics. They pushed their trenches closer to the fortress, inch by inch, using wooden shields and raised earth to cover their movements. By the third day, their forward positions were close enough to reach the slope before defenders could fire more than a handful of shots. That was when the first scaling attempts began. Tall ladders were carried forward under shields. Iron hooks were thrown at the parapets. The defenders met them head on. The fighting on the walls was immediate and physical. Soldiers shoved ladders back with poles. Others used spears to push attackers off before they reached the top. Arrows, boiling water, stones, anything that could break momentum was used. The noise was constant. Wood cracking, armor scraping, boots scrambling against stone. It did not take long for the strain to show. Eger didn't have endless reserves of men. Every defender counted and every injury mattered. Fatigue crept into arms and legs long before the cannons stopped for the day. Many soldiers fought with bandaged hands or bruised ribs. Some didn't leave the wall for hours at a time, rotating positions only when the next wave climbed into view. Inside the fortress, repairs never stopped. Workers filled cracks with mortar that barely had time to dry. Reinforcement beams were hammered into weak spots. Buckets of stone were carried to the ramparts faster than they were used. Through all of this, Bornemissza kept working. His first wave of weapons had slowed the Ottoman infantry. But now he needed something that could deal with the ladders and men climbing up under constant cover. He adapted quickly, creating smaller fire pots that could be dropped between the rungs, igniting the ladders from within. He mixed powders to burn hotter and longer, hoping to force attackers to retreat before they reached the top. In the evenings, his workspace became a center of controlled chaos. Assistants running between tables, measuring powders, sealing clay, testing fuses. Soldiers passed by carrying broken weapons, asking for repairs or replacements. The sound of hammers and grinding stones continued long after the cannon stopped. By the end of the week, the southern wall was on the edge of collapse. A deep crack split through one section, large enough for a man to place his arm inside. Each new cannon blast sent fragments falling inward. The defenders reinforced it with everything they could find: timber, sandbags, earth. But the fortress felt the growing pressure with each blow. Everyone sensed the same thing. If the wall broke, the next assault would pour directly into the breach, and the Ottomans knew it too. They increased the bombardment, shifting their heaviest guns to concentrate fire on that single weakness. The thudding impacts became slower but deeper, as if each shot was meant to push the wall just a little closer to giving way. The defenders stood ready behind it, waiting for the inevitable. As sunset fell on the 8th day, the damaged section trembled with every hit. Dust drifted down in steady sheets. The air tasted of stone, smoke, and exhaustion. Eger had endured longer than anyone expected, but the wall that protected them was reaching its limit. If the next day brought another concentrated assault, the fight would no longer be on the battlements. It would be inside the fortress, and everyone knew the difference. Eger had held so far through fire, ladders, trenches, and overwhelming artillery, but the moment of collapse was drawing closer with every heartbeat. On the morning of the 9th day, the Ottoman army shifted into a different rhythm. The cannon fire, once steady, now struck with heavier intent. Each blast hit the same weakened section of the southern wall, shaking the entire fortress. Stones dropped in clumps. Dust billowed through the cracks. The defenders felt the vibration in their boots long before the breach appeared. Late in the morning, the wall finally gave way. A section collapsed inward, sending debris across the courtyard and opening a jagged gap wide enough for several men to enter at once. The sound of the fall rolled through the fortress like a warning, the kind that leaves no room for misunderstanding. The next assault would not climb ladders. It would come straight through the opening. The Ottomans moved quickly. Infantry surged toward the breach, supported by archers and artillery. Standards lifted, drums pounded. This was the push meant to finish the siege. Engineers cleared rubble, making space for the first wave to advance. Their confidence was evident. They had broken stronger walls than this. Inside the fortress, defenders rushed to fill the line. Soldiers formed tight ranks behind the fallen stones. Civilians carried sandbags and beams, building a makeshift barricade. Every step echoed urgency. No one waited for orders. Everyone understood what was at stake. The first wave hit fast. Ottoman infantry stormed the breach, climbing over broken stone and firing upward at the defenders. Spears and muskets met them at close range. The space was tight, noisy, violent. The defenders had height, but the attackers had momentum, and each push drove them farther into the rubble. Above the breach, Bornemissza prepared his last set of weapons. He had saved the most dangerous mixtures for this moment. Fire pots designed to burst outward in every direction, and compact charges meant to ignite on contact. He and his team worked without pause, lighting fuses in quick succession and dropping the devices directly into the press of bodies, forcing their way forward. The effect was immediate. Flashes erupted among the advancing infantry. Fire spread through the rubble. The narrow space magnified the blasts, sending men stumbling backward and buying seconds of breathing room for the defenders. But the Ottomans pushed again and again. Each wave pressed deeper than the one before. The noise rose to a constant roar. Steel on stone, boots scraping, the shouts of men trying to hold a line that refused to stay still. The defenders fought until their arms went numb, retreating only when the pressure forced them back a step at a time. For a moment it looked as though the wall of defenders might finally break. Then the weather changed. A sudden shift in wind blew thick smoke from the Ottoman artillery back toward their own lines. Visibility dropped. Confusion spread. Some units slowed, unsure of where the breach actually stood. Others hesitated, waiting for orders that didn't come through clearly in the haze. It wasn't a storm. It wasn't a miracle. Just a brief turn of nature that arrived at the exact moment Eger needed it. The defenders seized the chance. They surged forward from inside the breach, driving pikes into the disoriented attackers. Bornemissa's last fire pots ignited along the slope, creating barriers of heat that split the Ottoman formation. Arrows rained from the towers into the pockets of soldiers trying to regroup. Every defender, wounded or exhausted, joined the final push. The momentum shifted. The Ottoman infantry, unable to recover cohesion, retreated downhill to safer ground. Their commanders attempted to rally them for another assault, but hesitation had crept into the ranks. The breach had been opened, yet the fortress had not fallen. By the end of the day, it became clear that the final blow had failed. That night, the Ottoman camp was quieter than usual. Messengers rode from tent to tent. Engineers inspected the cannons, but no new positions were prepared. Even the drums were still. And the next morning, the decision was unmistakable. The Ottoman army began to withdraw. Their artillery was pulled away first, then the infantry units marched south, leaving the valley slowly and without ceremony. Eger did not celebrate. Most defenders were too tired even to speak. Many simply sat along the walls, staring at the emptying field, unsure how to react to the sight of survival. The fortress had not won by strength. It had won by lasting longer than the enemy expected. When the final columns disappeared beyond the ridge, a heavy silence settled over Eger. The walls were cracked. Homes were damaged. The people were exhausted. But the fortress still stood, and so did the will that kept it standing. In the years that followed, the siege of 1552 became more than a military event. It became a symbol, proof that a small garrison, outnumbered and outgunned, could hold when everything suggested it should fall. It showed that ingenuity mattered, that leadership mattered, and that the courage of ordinary people could shape history. Eger did not change the course of the empire, but it changed the course of those who lived behind its walls. And that was enough.